All right, everyone, welcome to Music Theory with Matthew. This is the second session, really exciting. We're so happy to have you here. This is the second of 6, so we're going to keep doing this through August 26th. So thanks for joining, and thank you for joining for all of our other online programming that we are doing here at the Symphony. We're really grateful that we can do this for free. So if you're able, give us a quick donation next time you reserve a ticket with us. We'd really appreciate that. We've got a lot of really cool programming coming your way this summer and this following year, so we really appreciate it. Next week, we're going to be doing an online session called Creating an Orchestral Season. That is going to feature Gerhard Zimmerman, Matthew here, as well as Michelle Charles, our executive director. They're going to be discussing how we put together the orchestral season that you see each year. Really cool conversation about choosing music and budgets, actually, and stuff like that. So it'll be a really fun conversation, so make sure to reserve your ticket for that online. If you have any questions about any upcoming things, feel free to message me and I will help you out with that. And without further ado, without talking too much, I'll just turn it over to Matthew and we'll get started.
All right. Thank you so much, Rachel. So we are going to basically do a little bit of a recap of everything we talked about last week. And then we're going to pick up right where we left off and continue to explore more layers of how music is put together. So I'm going to share my screen here and get my, oh, Rachel, you're going to need to enable screen sharing for me.
You're good.
Thank you. Okay. So, all right, so last week we talked about how music is put together, and we started from the very, very beginning, the notes that we have available, 12 notes. And then after that, we get to the next octave up, the next C up, and it starts all over again. You see, as we showed last week, notes on the piano keyboard on top, and the notes as printed on the treble clef or the G clef on the bottom. From notes, we looked at our 12 intervals: minor second, major second, minor third, major third, perfect fourth, augmented fourth or diminished fifth, also known as the tritone, perfect fifth, minor sixth, major sixth, minor seventh, major seventh, and finally the perfect octave, at which point everything starts over again. I just played the intervals harmonically, where I sounded both pitches at once, but of course we can also play our intervals melodically, and you hopefully recall all of the wonderful common melodies that everybody hopefully knows that we went over last week to help you remember what each of the intervals sounds like. Now, we also can put these intervals together into larger melodies, such as this melody from The Sound of Music. When you know the notes to sing, you can sing most anything. And this melody is both a collection of notes, but also a collection of intervals. Each note is separated by an interval, as you can see here. Now, from intervals, 2 dimensions, the connection between 2 lines on a line graph, we went to triads, 3 notes, 3 dimensions, and we built the major, minor, and diminished triads from sets of intervals. The major triad, a major third on the bottom, a minor third after that, and then a perfect fifth on the outside, making the major triad. The minor triad, the thirds are reversed. We have a minor third on the bottom, major third above it, and perfect fifth still on the outside, making up the minor triad. The diminished triad is a stack of 2 minor thirds on top of one another. And this time we have a tritone, or diminished fifth, on the outside, sounding like this. Nice crunchy sound. So that's where we've been so far in a nutshell. Now, what happens when we add one more note to a triad? Now we get what we call a 7th chord. We built a triad out of 2 thirds, a third and then a third, and we're going to do the exact same thing to get a 7th chord. We're going to stack another third on top of what we already have. So we have a major triad here, a major third on the bottom, a minor third above it, and now we're going to add another minor third on top of that. On the outside, we now have a minor 7th. There's a place, minor 7th on the outside, and then still the rest of the components of our major triad. This is called a dominant 7th chord. The reason why we call it this may not be immediately apparent, but it will be explained, maybe not today, but at least certainly by next week. So, dominant 7th chord is a major triad and then a minor third on top of it, creating a minor 7th as the outer interval. Now, let's do the same thing except this time with a minor triad. We have our minor third on the bottom, our major third above it, and now we're going to, just like we did with the major chord to create a dominant 7th, we're going to add a minor third on top. This is creating the minor 7th chord. Funny, it sounds, to me always, the minor 7th chord sounds less minor than the minor triad. Sounds very dark. Sounds a little less so, in my opinion. So the minor 7th chord, a minor triad with a minor third on top of it, and then a minor 7th between the outer voices. Now, going on, the diminished triad, we actually have 2 options to create a 7th chord. And as such, we have 2 different names that we're going to label it with. So we have our diminished triad, 2 minor thirds stacked on top of each other, with a tritone or diminished fifth on the outside. Now, what did we do to the previous 2 chords to create our 7th chord? We added a minor third. So we're going to do the same thing here. Almost makes an even darker sound than just the diminished. Very, very crunchy. It's interesting, when we create the fully diminished 7th chord, if we add another minor third on top of this chord, we get back to the root of the chord. We get back to C. It's an interesting phenomenon. It's really the only chord that's quite like that, where you can cycle through the same interval 4 times and get right back to where you started. Now, the fully diminished 7th chord was similar to the major and minor 7th chords in that we added a minor third on top of all 3 of the triads. What we call the half diminished 7th chord is similar to the major and minor triads, major and minor 7th chords, in that there is a minor 7th between the outer voices. And in order to do that, we actually have to cheat a little bit and add a major third on top of the diminished triad. So we have our diminished triad. And now we're going to add a major third on top. So that's the sound of the half diminished seventh chord. It's a little bit different. I'll play both the fully diminished and the half diminished in sequence, just so you can get the difference in your ear a bit. That's our fully diminished. And here's our half diminished. Fully, half. Little bit different flavor between the two. The half diminished sounds just a little bit brighter than the complete darkness of the fully diminished. Now, diminished seventh chords have been used since the classical period, Mozart, Beethoven, Haydn, but their use really proliferated in the Romantic period, and particularly with one famous composer of opera, Richard Wagner. Maybe at least one of the most famous named chords in all of Western music history is what we call the Tristan chord. It is the first chord that is heard at the beginning of the opera Tristan and Isolde by Wagner. And it's famous for the way it doesn't resolve for the entire opera until the very end, after you've heard 4 hours or so of music. But it sounds something like this. It's a half diminished seventh chord. I'll play the excerpt that you see at the bottom of your screen. There's your half diminished seventh. Very, very, very famous leitmotif, as we call it. We'll get to those in a couple of weeks, most likely. But there's your half diminished seventh chord. Now, essentially, everything we've talked about, major, minor, diminished triad, dominant seventh, minor seventh, fully diminished seventh, and half diminished seventh, are really the nuts and bolts of what you're going to find in Western music. It's not, in Western music up until the 20th century, it's not that many different types of chords. Now, are there others? Absolutely. Couple of examples. Less used in the music we're going to talk about, but they exist. The major seventh chord is, we get a major seventh chord when we put a major third instead of a minor third on top of a major triad. So we have our major triad, major third on top. Instead of the dominant seventh like this, major seventh like this. This is a really common chord in the world of jazz music. You'll hear this all over the place if you listen to big band or the wonderful quartet players of the 50s, all over the place in jazz, all throughout jazz history. Not so much in the music that we're going to be talking about. The other one is the augmented triad, two major thirds stacked on top of one another. And like the fully diminished seventh chord, if you add another major third on top of this, you get back to where we started, back to C. Interesting sound. Not going to encounter it so much, but I just wanted to make you aware that it exists and that it can be used. Now, we have our chords that we're going to be using by and large in the music we're going to be talking about. We're going to talk a little bit now about the way we're going to discuss chords. When we label the notes in a triad, we have 3 notes, and we're going to call them essentially after the intervals that they make. Now, the bottom note, of course, doesn't have an interval. It just is the first note, and we call this note the root of the chord. The root, good term, it's on the bottom. It sort of holds everything together. It also defines the name of the chord. This is a C major chord that you see here, and it's C major because the root of the chord is C. Now, in a major chord, of course, we go up a major third from the root, so we call that note simply the third of the chord. We go up a perfect fifth from the root to get the third note of the chord. We call it the fifth of the chord. Now, it's important to know here, it doesn't matter if we're talking about a major chord, a minor chord, a diminished chord. It doesn't matter if it's a major or minor third from the root. It's always going to just be called the third of the chord. We'll know that if we're in a minor context, you don't always have to say, oh, that the minor third of that chord. Or if we're in a diminished triad context, you don't always have to say the diminished fifth of that chord. Root, third, fifth, and we will have already established what kind of chord we're talking about. Now, if we add one more note, get to our dominant seventh chord here. Same thing. We go up a seventh from the root to get the last note of this chord. So we call it the seventh of the chord. Doesn't matter if it's a diminished seventh, doesn't matter if it's a minor seventh or rarely a major seventh. Just call it the seventh of the chord. Now, this is all well and good, but it would get a little boring if the chord always had to appear the way we've been talking about it. So we've always shown, up till now, I've always shown you examples where the root is the bottom note of the chord, the third is the second note, and the fifth is the top note. But if we just went all over the keyboard, if that's all we could do, we would be extremely limited in the type of music that we create. So, naturally, as you may expect, the notes of the chord can appear in any order that the composer wishes to put them in. And this we call the inversions of the chord. Now, as I mentioned, the notes can be in any order, but what determines whether a chord is in inversion or not is which note of the chord is the bottom note. So, as thus far, I had shown you all what we call root position triads. And root position because the root is the bottom note of the chord. With the root C as the bottom note. Now, triads have three notes, so there are three notes that could possibly be the bottom note of the chord, the other two being the third and the fifth. So these are what we call the two inversions of a triad. First inversion occurs when we have the third as the lowest note of the chord. You can hear the E, the third of the chord is the lowest note. Second inversion, naturally, the only option left, we have the fifth as the bottom note of the chord. You can hear that G down there as the bottom note. Now, as triads can have inversions, seventh chords can have inversions as well. We have four notes now, so instead of just root position with two inversions, we have root position with three inversions. The difference, of course, being that third inversion, the seventh, is the lowest note of the chord. So, root position dominant seventh chord sounds like this. We already heard it. first inversion with the third of the chord, the E on the bottom, sounds like this. Second inversion with the fifth of the chord as the lowest note. G as the lowest note, and finally with the seventh, the B flat as the lowest note. Now, it's important to remember when we're working with inversions, we want to identify the root of the chord always. The root is what determines the type of chord it is. So the bottom note, as we've seen, might not always be the root, but you have to figure out by looking at the whole chord, what type of chord it is, which note is the root, and which inversion it's in. So what I show you here on the grand staff is a C major triad in first inversion. We have our E on the bottom, then our root, C, then the fifth, G, and then we have another root thrown in for good measure on the top. This is a C major chord in first inversion. It is not an E chord of any type. Just because E is on the bottom, it's not an E chord. It has the three notes that are in a C major triad, C, E, G, just not in the order that we had seen thus far. And as we mentioned, in first inversion. Now, whatever order the rest of the notes come in, the inversion that we are in is affected solely by the lowest note in the chord. So we can put the rest of the notes in wherever we want. Put E in the bass, put G second, then put the root on top. We can do that. We can have E, then the root, then the fifth, then the other root, as you see on the screen. Any order is possible, whatever the composer feels like doing. Now, the daunting part of this is that so far we've been in the key of C, and we have 12 keys. So essentially, take everything that we have talked about, all of the chords and inversions and everything that we've talked about, and multiply it by 12. And that's really what we're working with. But don't let that discourage you. So we've gone through the types of chords that we're going to see most frequently in classical music. Ultimately, as I mentioned at the very beginning of the first session, ultimately it's up to the composer what they want to do. They can use the notes however they wish. At the end of the day, music theory, the rules of music theory are derived from what the composers did. And the composers, when composers chose to break the rules is how music has advanced over the years, from Gregorian chant to orchestral music in all different styles. So we have our chords, triads, seventh chords. What next? How are we going to put these together to make music? Now, before I go on, I would like any questions that we have.
Hi,
this is a good place to take questions. Yes.
Not a question, just a question that I think has been said to me, but also is one that I asked a lot when I was first, talking about music and looking at music. Is, you said multiply by 12, right? So we're looking at all these chords and all these different inversions. And if it's not in a root position, it's not necessarily obvious which chord it is. You have to really do some analysis to be able to figure out which chord it is, right? So
correct.
What are maybe some things that you do or that can be done to more quickly identify what it is you're actually looking at?
So that is where the intervals come in. At the end of the day, a major chord is a major third from the root, and then a minor third on top, or a perfect fifth from the root. So whatever key we're in, look at the notes you have and write them out. Just write them out in any order. Just take the notes you have in a chord from the bottom up. Write the letter names out. A, C sharp, G, E. Write the notes out. Then see if you can put them in the order that they would appear on the piano keyboard. That's the first step. Once you do that, then you can sort of get an idea of how they relate to one another. The most basic idea of how they relate to one another. And then look for the intervals. If you see a tritone, if you see a diminished fifth in there, oh, maybe it's a diminished chord. Not always. It gets harder. It's harder when you're starting out to identify chords in inversion. You sort of, it's good to know what the root position version of each chord looks like. Because then if you know the notes that are in the root position chord, you can sort of see, oh, I know those notes. I recognize that collection of notes. And except the root is not on the bottom, so it must be in an inversion.
Yeah.
It's something, remember everybody, I have been making music since I was 4 or so years old, and I took my first music theory class 12 years ago. So, and I've been conducting and studying scores ever since. So it's not something that you'll be able to do overnight. But if you can just remember how we construct the chords, how each of them is constructed, and then sort of take a look at what each type of chord looks like in the different keys. Pick a note, any note on the piano, and build a root position major triad, a root position minor triad, a root position diminished triad, seventh chords, dominant, minor, half diminished, fully diminished. Build them using the intervals, and then start practicing, assimilating, internalizing what they all look like. And then you'll be able to see things quicker in general.
Mm-hmm.
You're just glancing at a piece.
Yeah.
Question?
One other thing I think, so like the understanding of, for someone who's the quote, average Joe, the concert goer, the average concert goer, like what can you appreciate more about the music and the concert when you know this knowledge? I get this might be a question we might answer a little later. And
I would rather do that later. I would rather cover that later.
I think that's something to think about though. Yeah. As we're going forward, this idea of, why is the composer doing this? And I know we're going to get to this later. And I know that you're going to get to this later about why the composers choose to do these things and how it helps you understand the music. But something to think about as we go, probably for everyone listening, is what do you think why do you think this is important? And then I'm sure Matthew will get to that as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And you know what, I feel like it's hard sometimes to see when we're just trying to establish the building blocks of what we're working with. It's hard to see like where we are going, where this is going eventually. Sometimes.
Keep it in mind. Everyone hold on to your seats. We'll get there.
Bear with me. We'll get to all that.
Yeah.
we'll get to that in due course of time. But right now, I'm trying to do this in as linear building block fashion as I can, just so that everybody here, musicians and non-musicians alike, we can all sort of be on a similar page, similar basic page as we start looking at bigger and bigger things.
Yep, I think that's all for now.
Great. All right. So how do we put all this stuff together to make music? Right now, we just talked about it in isolation. Now we're going to start to see how it all works together. So the first thing we're going to discuss for this is the major scale. The way I like to think of a scale, and I think a good way for all of you to think about it, is it is a linear set of notes separated by a set pattern of intervals. So the major scale, I'm sure all of you know what a major scale sounds like. If you've seen The Sound of Music, you know what a major scale sounds like. And you probably even have a mnemonic device to help you remember how a scale goes. And it might look something like this. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. And all of Oscar Hammerstein's wonderful animals, objects, experiences that go along with remembering these. So, if you can remember how Julie Andrews teaches the Von Trapp family singers how to sing a scale, a major scale in The Sound of Music, you know what a major scale sounds like. Now, we have 7 notes, with the 8th one being a repeat of the first one. And in between each of these notes, we have an interval. First 2 notes, a major second, happy birthday. The second 2 notes, D to E, we have another major second. E to F, we have a minor second this time. F to G, and G to A, and A to B, we have 3 major seconds in a row. And finally, E to C, we have our other minor second. So, every major scale has the same collection of intervals in the same order. 5 major seconds total, 2 minor seconds total, in the order of 2 major seconds, 1 minor second, 3 major seconds, and 1 minor second. Every major scale. You can start on whatever note you would like and follow these exact same intervals, and you will get the major scale based on that note. There are 12 of them, 12 notes, 12 starting points for this set of intervals, 12 major scales. Now, this is a C major scale. We're going to use the key of C major for most of the rest of our discussion today because it only uses the white keys on the piano, as you can see. C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. Just a little bit easier to conceptualize. But we have 12 major scales. Some of them use all of the black keys. Some of them use more or less of them. So we can build major scales off of any note, as I mentioned. This is an E flat major scale. Major second, major second, minor second, major second, major second, major second, minor second. 3 black keys, E flat, A flat, B flat. Here's another one, A major. This time we use sharps. Same thing. Major second, minor second, major second, major, major, minor. So, the notes of a major scale are considered to be the notes that are in the major key of the note that it starts on. So, if you sit down at the Canton Symphony in January of 2019 to hear us play Beethoven's Symphony No. 3 in E flat major, this is the scale that that piece is based on. If you hear Beethoven's 7th Symphony in A major, this is the scale it's based on. Now, the scales that a piece is based on, the notes in the scale that are going to occur the most commonly in the piece. In C major, we only have white keys of the piano, but every other key has at least one black key in it. We have symbols that you've already seen a little bit of to show when a black key needs to be played. For flats, such as the key of E flat major, we use this little stylized B. I think of it as a B, and you can even see here in normal font below it, I wrote E flat major by using an uppercase E and a lowercase b. But the flat symbol is basically a stylized lowercase b, essentially. And then on the right-hand side here, in the key of A major, people of my generation and above would call this a pound sign or maybe a number sign. People of the iGen, regrettably, call this a hashtag. But either way, it's the symbol we use in music to show when something is sharp. Now, when it's flat, you take the note that is printed and lower it by 1/2 step. So if we have A and you see a flat next to that A, you lower it so it becomes A flat. A, lowered 1/2 step to A flat. Sharp, just the opposite. Take the note you see, raise it 1/2 step. C, C sharp, 1/2 step above. So we use what we call key signatures to show the key that we're in. We do this because if we're in a key that has a lot of black keys of the piano, a lot of sharps or flats, we don't want to have to write the sharp or flat symbol next to each note each time that note happens. It's in the key. It's going to happen a lot in the piece. Why waste the ink? Why clutter up the page and make it easy to read? So we use what we call a key signature. Key signatures appear at the beginning of each line of music. So if you're a violin player sitting in the Canton Symphony reading your music, you have one line of music at a time that goes by, and at the beginning of each line, you'll see the key signature, and it's your job to remember, oh yeah, we're in the key of A major here. I have to, if I see a C on the music, it's actually going to be C sharp because the key signature dictates it, even though there's no sharp symbol next to that immediate note. The only time there will be a symbol, if we have a piece with a key signature, there will only be a symbol when you have to play a sharp or a flat that's not part of that key, or when you're supposed to play the natural note of a note that is a sharp or a flat. Otherwise, the key signature will tell you what we're doing. So, 12 notes, 12 major keys that can be built off of them, 12 major scales, 12 key signatures. If we start here with C major, if you go clockwise on this diagram, you see that we add 1 sharp to the key signature each time. When we get to the very, very bottom, we have 6 sharps, and at that point, we would just have too many sharps. So the tritone away from C, F sharp or G flat, the major key based on both, that starts on that note, either is going to have 6 sharps or 6 flats, the most we can have, generally the most we can have. And at that point, you start using flats. If you start from the top, C major, once again, and go counterclockwise, we add a flat each time. The ordering of the keys in this diagram is what we call the circle of fifths. And we call it this because if you start at C major, you start at the top and go clockwise around the circle, we go up a fifth each time. So the C major has no sharps or flats in the key signature. The key with 1 sharp, G major, is a perfect fifth away from C major. Twinkle, twinkle, perfect fifth. If we add another sharp, the key with 2 sharps in it is D major, and it is a fifth above G. So on and so forth. 3 sharps is a fifth up from D. A to E, 4 sharps, another fifth. E to B, 5 sharps. Now, of course, we're getting very, very high in the piano at this point. Eventually, you're going to have to jump back down, but you can essentially follow it all the way around back to C. If we start a little bit lower at B, we can go up to F sharp, another fifth, 6 sharps. Now we'll switch over to flats, 6 flats, G flat. And now think of this, instead of adding a sharp, we're taking away a flat, which sort of does the same thing. Instead of actively raising a note, we're taking away a note that was lower. So we go G flat to D flat, 6 flats to 5, still up a fifth. D flat to A flat, A flat to E flat. Now we're only down to 3 flats. E flat to B flat, B flat to F, and finally F back to C, back to where we started. The circle of fifths. This will come in the importance of fifths and the importance of the circle of fifths will become even more evident as we continue our discussion in the coming weeks. Now, as you've probably noticed, you may have noticed, I shouldn't say probably, as you may have noticed, when we add a sharp, the sharps that are already there don't go away. So we add F sharp first to be in the key of G major. When we add C sharp, we don't take away the F sharp. We simply add to what we already have, and so on and so forth. The sharps will always appear in the exact same order every time. And there's a mnemonic device, excuse me, to help you remember these. The order of sharps. F sharp is first, and continuing from there. Father Charles goes down and ends battle. Yay. F, C, G, D, A, E, B. In that order, that's the order that the sharps will appear. B sharp, it's the same as C natural. You're almost never going to see it. It's going to be a more often than not, an unusual chord if you see a B sharp. Now, flats. It's the exact reverse of the order of the sharps. And we're going to use the same mnemonic device. Unfortunately, it's going to have a much darker meaning this time. Battle ends and down goes Charles's father. A lot darker on the flat side, but how I learned it, it's a good way to remember the order that you add a sharp or add a flat as you go around the circle of fifths, forward or backward. So, going back to our major scale. Major scale defines the major key. All of the notes that are in the major key can be found in the major scale. So, in order to get the chords that we find in a major key, we are simply going to build a triad off of each note of the major scale. And this is what we get. Building a triad, staying within the key, not changing any notes that we don't have already in the key. This is what we get. So C, the first note of the scale, we build a triad off of C, a third and a fifth, and it ends up being a major third and a perfect fifth. So we have a major chord, of course, unsurprisingly. Kumbaya, a lovely major chord. Next, second note of the scale, D. We add a third. Staying within the key, it's going to be a minor third, but also a perfect fifth. So from D, we build a minor chord. E, likewise, we have a minor third, perfect fifth. E will also be minor. F, we get another major one. Major third, perfect fifth. G will also be major. A, we're back to minor. And the lone diminished chord that we get in a major key is from the 7th scale degree. So those 7 chords are going to be, for the most part, the chords that make up the harmonies of a piece of music in a major key. We label these in music theory. Music theorists label these using Roman numerals. And the reason we do that is because just like every major scale has the same collection of intervals, regardless of the starting pitch, every major key has the same triads in it, regardless of starting pitch. The first triad, based off of the root of the scale, the bottom note of the scale, is going to be major. The triad based off of the third of the scale is going to be minor. And the triad based off of the 7th of the scale is going to be diminished. No matter what major key you're in, this is how it's going to play out. So we label these using capital or lowercase Roman numerals. Capital if it's major, lowercase if it's minor, and then, of course, the way we write, we only have capital and lowercase, so we need a little extra something when we're talking about diminished triads. And for this, we're going to add a little degree symbol next to the 7 to indicate that we have a diminished triad. We do this so that we can analyze music in whatever key we want and show how the chords relate to one another and how they relate to the scale that the piece is based on. The word we use in music theory to describe these triads is diatonic. It's a great piece of music theory vocabulary, diatonic triads. And they're called that because we did not have to change any of the notes from our C major scale, from our major scale, to obtain these triads. We simply put a third and a fifth on top of each note of the major scale and stayed within the notes that we have available in the scale to build our triad. Diatonic triads, music theory vocabulary for you. Okay, that was, I know, probably kind of a lot. Any questions about that?
Don't have any on my end.
All right, great. This is a quiet crowd. I hope everyone's still, I hope everyone hasn't fallen asleep on me.
I'm pretty sure they're all taking furious notes.
Oh, well, I'm honored if that's the case. Okay, so these are the triads built on a major scale. Now, let's talk about when we're in a minor key. Here we have the natural minor scale, what we call the C natural minor scale. Now, as before, with the major scale, a natural minor scale is going to have a set collection of intervals that defines the quality of the scale. In this case, looks like this. Major second is first. C to D sounds just like the beginning of the major scale. The second interval is a little different. We have our minor second from D to E flat coming one place earlier than it did in the major scale, and this changes everything. We had at first, now we have much completely changes just by shifting the minor second from the third position to the second position. Changes the way it sounds. From E flat, we have two major seconds in a row, E flat to F, F to G, then another minor second, G to A flat, and two major seconds to finish us up. A flat to B flat to C. Taken all together, it sounds like this. Now, just like with the major scale, you can start on any note. Have a major second, a minor second, two major seconds, a minor second, and two major seconds, and it will be a natural minor scale, whichever note you start on. Scale, the quality of the scale, the type of scale is simply the collection of intervals. Now, you may have noticed that the C minor scale has three flats. Just like another scale we looked at a few minutes ago, the E flat major scale. And as we expect, they are the same three flats in each occurrence. B flat, E flat, A flat. Battle ends and. The only difference is the note that we start on. So these two keys, E flat major and C minor, are what we call relatives of each other. I have two relatives on this Zoom call, my mom, Ann, and my aunt, Terry. Just like we are all relatives, these two keys are relatives to one another. So when we're talking about E flat major in relation to C minor, E flat major is what we call the relative major of C minor. Conversely, C minor is the relative minor of E flat major. Now, we just looked at from the minor scale built on C, we're going to move over and talk about the minor scale built on A. The reason we're doing this is because A minor is the relative minor of C major, and C major is the relative major of A minor. As we discussed before, it's a little easier to see some of the things that we're talking about when we just stick to the white keys of the piano. No sharps or flats. It's just a little bit easier to first expose yourself to all this when you can cut out some of the complexity. So we're going to switch over and use the key of A minor for our discussion of minor. Finding the relative key, simple way to do it. The relative minor of a major key is a minor third below the root of the major key. So we have C major, go down a minor third, and we get A. That's how we know that A is the relative minor. A minor is the relative minor of C major. You do the reverse to get the relative major. Start on A minor third above A is C. C is the relative major of A minor. Pretty easy. Now, we have our diatonic triads built on the A natural minor scale, just as we had our diatonic triads built on the major scale. Only difference, the type of chord, the quality of chord is going to be different. So the chord based on the first note of the scale, A, this time is going to be a minor triad. The diminished triad comes up fairly quickly this time. It's the second note of the chord, the second note of the scale. Third note is going to be a major triad this time. Fourth and fifth are minor. And the sixth, sorry, it says seventh twice there. The sixth F is major, and the seventh, of course, is also major. Now, these are the triads built on the A natural minor scale. However, these are not the triads that are typically used by composers when harmonizing music in a minor key. Most of them are. 5 of these are common. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 6 are exactly what you see. What composers usually do with 5 and 7 is contrary to what you would expect. And for this, we're going to have to talk about another scale, what we call the harmonic minor scale. 5 and 7, as I mentioned, the 2 chords that aren't typically what you would expect them to be. So, natural minor scale versus the harmonic minor scale. The natural minor scale, as I mentioned, we have all white keys of the piano. Harmonic minor, we're going to change one note, and it's the 7th note of the scale. Instead of our G natural of the natural minor scale, we have G sharp in the harmonic minor. And interestingly, it creates the interval that we call the augmented second. Typically going from F to G is going to be a second, either a major or minor second. In this case, we're going from F to G sharp. Sounds like a minor third. What child? But because of the way it's written as some type of F going to some type of G, we're going to call it a second. And in this case, an augmented second, the next step up from a major second. The augmented second is really characteristic of the music of the Far East, Arabian music. That type of sound. That is the augmented second in all of its glory. Rachel, how am I doing on time?
It just hit 7 o'clock.
All right, we're gonna pick up with minor.
I feel like
the
that's
minor
a fun little,
keys.
it's a fun ditty to end on. I feel like that's a
Yeah.
it's a good thing to end on.
Now, I must ask, are there any questions about anything I talked about today?
Any questions? I don't have anything that got sent to me. Anyone have any questions about this? Oh.
Feel free to just turn your video on and ask at this point if you would like.
Yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and stop the video for now since that's the bulk, and we can keep chatting. I do have